There is a specific, terrifying genre of violence that exists exclusively within the upper echelons of the American tax bracket. It does not involve bruised ribs or shattered glass. It is entirely silent, legally sanctioned, and executed with the sterile precision of a fountain pen on heavy stock paper. We are culturally conditioned to fear the stranger in the alleyway, the home invader in the dead of night, but the most profound destruction of a human life is rarely perpetrated by a stranger. It is almost always orchestrated by the person sharing your bed, the person named as your emergency contact, the person whose signature sits right next to yours on the joint tax return. The story of Eleanor Vance is a masterclass in the absolute, devastating architecture of financial betrayal. It is a forensic examination of a marriage that was, in reality, a heavily funded corporate illusion. Eleanor was a woman who believed she occupied the absolute center of her husband's universe. She was a fixture in the Manhattan art scene, directing a highly influential contemporary gallery in Chelsea. She was sophisticated, highly educated, and possessing an intellect that demanded respect. She was not a naive trophy wife who turned a blind eye to the household finances. This is the crucial, terrifying element of this narrative. Eleanor believed she knew everything. Her husband, Richard Vance, was a titan of commercial real estate in the tri-state area. He built mid-rise luxury condominiums, revitalized decaying commercial districts, and navigated the brutally corrupt zoning boards of New York with a charismatic ruthlessness that was widely celebrated. Together, Richard and Eleanor presented the flawless image of the modern, dual-income American power couple. They resided in a sprawling, meticulously restored Tudor estate in Scarsdale, New York. It was the kind of property that required a dedicated staff just to maintain the landscaping. Their life was a seamless choreography of charity galas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, summers spent in the agonizingly exclusive enclaves of Nantucket, and winter retreats to their chalet in Aspen. To look at their lives from the outside was to look at the absolute pinnacle of capitalist success. But more importantly, from Eleanor's perspective on the inside, their life was a partnership built on total transparency. Richard was not a man who operated in the shadows. He openly discussed his development projects over dinner. They sat down with their wealth management team at Morgan Stanley every quarter. Eleanor saw the spreadsheets. She saw the massive liquid capital sitting in their joint brokerage accounts. She saw the deed to the Scarsdale estate, completely unencumbered by a mortgage. She believed her future, her security, and her legacy were locked inside an impenetrable vault of shared prosperity. This is the psychological baseline you must understand before we dissect the catastrophe. Eleanor did not just love Richard. She trusted his structural integrity as a partner. When you build a life with someone at that level of financial complexity, trust is not just an emotion. It is a massive, multi-million-dollar liability. You are essentially handing another human being the launch codes to your entire existence, trusting that they will never turn the key. And for 12 years, Richard Vance played the role of the perfect fiduciary of their marriage. He was attentive, he was generous, and he was the architect of an incredibly beautiful life. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning in October. The air in New York was crisp, carrying that specific, electric energy of autumn in the city. Richard was at his private, outrageously expensive athletic club in Midtown Manhattan, playing a relentless game of squash with a junior partner from a prominent investment bank. According to the medical examiner's report, Richard suffered a massive, catastrophic aortic aneurysm right there on the polished hardwood court. It was a structural failure of his own heart, an invisible weakness that detonated without warning. He was dead before the paramedics even managed to navigate their rig through the Midtown traffic. When Eleanor received the phone call from Mount Sinai Hospital, she was standing in her gallery, examining a shipment of massive, abstract canvases that had just arrived from Berlin. The human brain cannot instantly process a trauma of that magnitude. It initiates a psychological quarantine, a state of hyperfunctional shock designed to keep the body moving while the soul catches up. Eleanor did not collapse. She did not scream. She systematically locked the doors of the gallery, instructed her assistant to cancel all appointments for the remainder of the week, and walked out onto the street to hail a town car. Over the next 7 days, Eleanor executed the role of the grieving American widow with a terrifying, flawless efficiency. I have observed the rituals of death among the ultra-wealthy, and it is a fascinating, disturbing spectacle. The grieving process is immediately outsourced. Event planners are hired, florists are flown in. The funeral itself transforms from a spiritual farewell into a high-stakes networking event, a somber pageant where industry rivals gather to assess the power vacuum left behind. The memorial service was held at a massive, historic church on the Upper East Side. The pews were packed with state senators, real estate developers, and the quiet, dangerous men who run private equity firms. Throughout it all, Eleanor stood perfectly straight, draped in conservative, impeccably tailored black wool. She accepted the condolences. She listened to the eulogies detailing Richard's immense integrity, his vision, and his profound dedication to his family. She absorbed the comforting words of their friends, who assured her that Richard had built an empire that would protect her for the rest of her natural life. She believed them. She had absolutely no reason not to. She went home to the massive, silent estate in Scarsdale, entirely consumed by a clean, pure grief. She was mourning a great man. She was mourning a beautiful marriage. The true death of Richard Vance did not occur on that squash court. The true, agonizing death of Richard Vance occurred 30 days later, on a miserable, rainy afternoon in November, inside the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed the law firm of Harrison Cole. Harrison was the senior partner specializing in estate planning and asset protection for high-net-worth individuals. He had been Richard and Eleanor's personal attorney for a decade. He had drafted their wills. He had overseen the purchase of the Aspen Chalet. He was not just a lawyer, he was a trusted confidant, a man deeply embedded in the architecture of their lives. Eleanor arrived at the law firm expecting a standard, bureaucratic transition of power. She expected to sign the necessary documents to transfer the joint accounts solely into her name, to review the execution of the life insurance policies, and to begin the arduous task of managing the estate. She was escorted into Harrison's corner office, a massive room paneled in dark mahogany and overlooking the gray, churning expanse of Central Park. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The first indicator that something was fundamentally wrong was not what Harrison said, but what he did not do. When Eleanor walked into the room, Harrison did not offer his usual warm, paternal smile. He did not stand up to greet her. He sat frozen behind his massive desk, his face the color of wet ash. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was an entirely disturbing mixture of profound pity and absolute, primitive terror. A thick, heavy file rested perfectly centered on his desk. He kept his hands flat on the leather blotter, avoiding eye contact entirely. In my years of analyzing corporate and domestic litigation, I have come to recognize the physical manifestation of complicity. Harrison Cole was a man whose entire career was built on discretion and protecting the assets of ruthless men. But sitting across from Eleanor, a woman he had dined with, a woman whose home he had visited, he looked like an executioner who had suddenly realized the innocence of the condemned. Eleanor sat down in the leather wingback chair opposite his desk. She placed her umbrella on the floor and asked him, with the calm authority of a woman accustomed to running large organizations, what the next steps were. Harrison cleared his throat. The sound was dry, rattling. He did not look at her when he spoke. He stared directly at the file. He began by reciting a pre-rehearsed, heavily sterilized legal disclaimer. He stated that his ethical obligation was to execute the final, documented wishes of his client, Richard Vance. He stated that as the executor of the estate, he was legally bound to present the reality of the financial situation exactly as it stood at the moment of Richard's death. The way he kept emphasizing the word reality made the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck stand up. It was the careful, measured language of a man preparing to detonate a bomb. Eleanor, slightly irritated by the delay, asked him to cut through the legalese. She told him she was well aware of their assets. She mentioned the Morgan Stanley accounts, the Scarsdale property, the commercial real estate portfolio holding companies. Harrison finally looked up. His eyes were hollow. He opened the thick file and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. It was a summary of the estate's liquid assets. Eleanor looked at the bottom line. The number was not in the tens of millions, as she knew it to be just 2 months prior. The number was barely 5 figures. It was a sum that would not even cover the property taxes on the Scarsdale estate for a single quarter. Eleanor stared at the paper, a cold, creeping numbness beginning to spread from the base of her spine. She told Harrison there was obviously a clerical error. She told him that she had just reviewed their portfolios with their wealth manager a week before Richard died. Harrison shook his head slowly. He explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The terrifying, invisible machinery of unilateral asset transfer. He explained that New York is an equitable distribution state, but it is not a community property state. He explained that Richard, as the primary income earner and the sole managing member of their numerous holding companies, had possessed the legal authority to move assets between corporate entities without requiring Eleanor's signature. Over the past 18 months, while Eleanor was running her gallery, while she was attending charity dinners with him, while she was sleeping next to him every single night, Richard had been engaging in a massive, systemic, and entirely covert liquidation of their shared existence. It was a financial evacuation executed with military precision. Harrison walked her through the timeline, sliding document after document across the desk. It was an autopsy of her entire reality. Richard had taken out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on the Scarsdale estate, completely draining the equity. He had utilized a loophole in the corporate structure to bypass the need for spousal consent on the primary residence. He had systematically liquidated their stock portfolios, moving the cash into a series of highly obscured, offshore corporate accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. He had sold off the most lucrative properties in his commercial real estate portfolio to a silent private equity firm at a fraction of their market value, demanding the payment in untraceable wire transfers. Eleanor sat paralyzed. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. The man described in these documents was not her husband. This was a hostile corporate raider. This was a sociopath meticulously dismantling an empire to hide the capital. She looked at Harrison, her voice finally cracking, and asked the only question that mattered. Where did the money go? Harrison pulled a final, heavy document from the file. It was bound in thick blue legal paper. He pushed it toward her. It was a trust document. Not the revocable living trust they had established years ago to protect their assets from probate. This was a completely new, irrevocable, ironclad trust established just 90 days prior to Richard's fatal heart attack. It was a fortress built of impenetrable legal jargon, designed specifically to withstand any civil litigation or probate dispute. Harrison explained that Richard had transferred the entirety of his liquidated empire, every dollar stolen from the Scarsdale equity, every offshore account, the total sum of over $40 million, into this irrevocable trust. And then Harrison turned to the page listing the sole, exclusive beneficiary of the trust. Eleanor read the name printed in stark, black ink. Evelyn Mercer. It was a name Eleanor had never heard in her life. It was not a charity. It was not a distant relative. Harrison, reading the total psychological collapse in Eleanor's eyes, provided the final, agonizing piece of context. Evelyn Mercer was a 28-year-old junior project assistant who had been hired at Richard's firm 2 years ago. I want to pause and dissect the specific, apocalyptic violence of this moment. When a partner engages in infidelity, it is a betrayal of the flesh, a breach of emotional contract. It is devastating, but it is a common human failure. But what Richard Vance had done transcended infidelity. He had not just taken a younger lover. He had spent 18 months looking his wife in the eye, every morning over coffee, making plans for their retirement, while actively, deliberately bankrupting her to fund a secret empire for his mistress. He had weaponized his superior knowledge of corporate law and the American banking system to financially annihilate the woman he had spent 12 years building a life with. He had ensured that upon his death, his 28-year-old assistant would inherit the wealth of a dynasty, while his wife of over a decade would inherit a heavily mortgaged, decaying estate and an avalanche of inescapable debt. He had not just left her for another woman. He had structurally erased her existence. He had made her entirely financially responsible for the illusion of their marriage, while transferring the actual capital to his secret reality. Eleanor did not cry. The shock was too profound for tears. When the human mind is subjected to a betrayal that completely invalidates its entire historical narrative, it often reacts with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She looked around the opulent mahogany office. She looked at the rain lashing against the glass, blurring the Manhattan skyline. She realized that the grief she had carried for the past 30 days was a complete and utter waste of energy. She had been mourning a man who never existed. She had been weeping over the grave of an assassin who had successfully executed her before he died. She looked back down at the name on the paper. Evelyn Mercer. $40 million, an impenetrable, irrevocable trust, a massive, looming debt on her own home. The pristine, elegant life of Eleanor Vance was officially dead, murdered by the man she had loved. As she sat in the heavy silence of the law office, feeling the cold leather of the chair beneath her, the profound, crippling despair began to rapidly mutate into something entirely different. It mutated into a cold, dark, and highly focused obsession. Richard Vance thought he had won. He thought he had taken his secrets to the grave and secured his legacy perfectly, but he had fundamentally underestimated the woman he had left behind to clean up the wreckage. The descent from the towering glass skyscraper of Harrison Cole's law firm back down to the unforgiving concrete of Manhattan was the longest elevator ride of Eleanor Vance's life. When you experience a psychological trauma of this magnitude, a trauma that entirely rewrites your past and permanently bankrupts your future, the human brain performs a terrifying physiological response. It completely shuts down the emotional processing centers to ensure basic biological survival. Eleanor did not stagger out of the building. She did not collapse on the avenue. She walked out into the biting November rain with the terrifying, upright posture of a woman who has just been executed but refuses to fall. She hailed a cab, slid onto the cracked leather seat, and gave the driver the address of the Scarsdale estate. She did not look out the window at the passing city. She sat perfectly still, staring at the back of the driver's headrest, and began the brutal, agonizing work of a psychological autopsy. I have spent thousands of hours analyzing the victims of extreme financial sociopathy, and I can assure you that the most agonizing pain does not come from the loss of the capital. The absolute, soul-crushing agony comes from the realization of your own complicity. Eleanor was not a fool. She was a director of a major contemporary art gallery. She negotiated with ruthless European art dealers and navigated the treacherous, ego-driven landscape of the New York art elite. Yet, she had allowed the man she slept next to systematically dismantle her reality over the course of 18 months without ever noticing the scent of the gasoline. As the cab navigated the winding, manicured roads of Westchester County, pulling into the sprawling, circular driveway of the Tudor estate she now knew was heavily mortgaged and virtually worthless to her, Eleanor forced herself to look at the signs she had missed. This is the torture of hindsight. The signs are always there, meticulously disguised as the mundane logistical requirements of an ultra-wealthy lifestyle. She remembered Richard's sudden, intense focus on restructuring their tax liabilities 18 months ago. He had sat her down in their gleaming, custom-built kitchen, poured her a glass of Barolo, and spoken passionately about insulating their assets from the volatile commercial real estate market. He had presented her with massive stacks of legally dense corporate restructuring documents, assuring her that these maneuvers were standard operating procedure for a portfolio of his size. He had kissed her forehead, told her he was building a fortress for their eventual retirement, and she, operating under the fatal delusion of absolute trust, had signed exactly where the yellow sticky notes indicated. She had literally authorized her own financial assassination under the guise of prudent marital planning. She had watched him change the passwords to their joint brokerage accounts, accepting his explanation that his new wealth management firm required dual-factor biometric authentication that was strictly bound to his personal devices for security compliance. Every single red flag had been expertly wrapped in the comforting, sterile language of corporate responsibility. He had weaponized his superior financial literacy to blind her. She unlocked the heavy oak door of the Scarsdale house and stepped into the cavernous, silent foyer. The house was a museum of their shared illusion. The antique Persian rugs, the massive crystal chandelier, the curated collection of mid-century modern furniture, it all looked identical to how it had looked that morning, but its fundamental molecular structure had changed. It was no longer a home. It was a perfectly preserved crime scene. Eleanor walked directly past the sweeping staircase and entered Richard's home office. This room had always been his sanctuary, a dark, masculine space of leather-bound books and polished mahogany. For 12 years, she had respected his privacy in this room, viewing it as the command center of the empire that protected her. Now, she viewed it as the laboratory where the monster had engineered her demise. She locked the heavy double doors behind her. She did not weep. Weeping is a surrender to grief, and Eleanor had realized in the lawyer's office that she had absolutely nothing left to grieve. You cannot mourn a man who spent the last year and a half plotting to destroy you. She began to tear the room apart. She operated with a cold, terrifying, and methodical rage. She ripped the drawers from his antique desk, dumping the contents onto the Persian rug. She tore the books from the shelves, searching for hidden safes, burner phones, encrypted hard drives. She was no longer a grieving widow. She was an investigative auditor searching for the blueprints of her own murder. I want to delve deep into the pathology of a man like Richard Vance, because his breed of sociopathy is uniquely cultivated by the American aristocratic system. Richard was a man who required the absolute adoration and validation of a high-status wife like Eleanor to legitimize his public image. She was his most valuable social asset. But behind closed doors, a narcissist of his caliber possesses an infinite, unquenchable void that requires constant, clandestine validation. The 28-year-old assistant, Evelyn Mercer, was not merely a sexual conquest. In the brutal economy of Manhattan power dynamics, a mistress is a commodity. She is a secret portfolio of worship that the narcissist controls entirely. But to transfer $40 million into an irrevocable trust for an assistant is not an act of passion. It is a highly calculated, structural maneuver. It requires an army of corrupt accountants, offshore tax attorneys, and a terrifying level of sustained, premeditated malice. Eleanor knew that Richard, despite his arrogance, was not legally brilliant enough to construct an irrevocable trust in the Cayman Islands that could completely bypass the draconian probate laws of New York State. He had help. He had an architect. This realization led Eleanor to pick up her phone and dial a number she had sworn 10 years prior she would never call again. She called Thomas Vance. Thomas was Richard's older brother, the absolute black sheep of the Vance family. While Richard had ruthlessly climbed the ladder of Manhattan real estate, Thomas had recognized the toxic, sociopathic rot at the core of their family's wealth early on. He had cashed out his minor inheritance a decade ago and exiled himself to a massive, isolated cattle ranch in the brutal wilderness of Montana, completely severing ties with Richard and the elite social circles of New York. Richard had always painted Thomas as a mentally unstable failure, a cautionary tale of a man who could not handle the pressure of legacy. Eleanor had believed Richard's narrative because it was comfortable. But standing in the wreckage of her husband's office, she realized that Thomas was not the failure. He was the only survivor. The phone rang 6 times before Thomas answered. The connection was static, the wind howling in the background of the Montana plains. Eleanor did not offer pleasantries. She did not announce Richard's death, knowing Thomas would have already read it in the Financial Times. She simply told Thomas that she was standing in Richard's office, that the estate was entirely bankrupt, that a woman named Evelyn Mercer possessed $40 million in an offshore trust, and that she needed to understand the exact nature of the predator she had married. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, stretching for nearly a minute before Thomas let out a dark, harsh laugh that lacked any trace of humor. It was the sound of a man hearing the inevitable conclusion to a tragedy he had predicted decades ago. Through the crackling connection, Thomas delivered a psychological profile of his dead brother that fundamentally shattered the last remaining fragments of Eleanor's reality. Thomas explained that Richard possessed a specific, terrifying compulsion. He did not just want to accumulate wealth. He was addicted to the total, absolute consumption of the people around him. Thomas told Eleanor about their father, a ruthless patriarch who had built the original real estate company. He told her how Richard, at the age of 25, had orchestrated a highly complex, completely legal hostile takeover of his own father's company, utilizing a shadow board of directors to vote his father out and strip him of his pension, leaving the old man to die in a state of humiliated bankruptcy. Thomas explained that Richard viewed human beings, even his own blood, even his own wife, as nothing more than structural supports for his ego. The moment those supports became inconvenient, or the moment he found a new, more compliant source of worship, he did not just walk away. He systematically detonated the old structure to ensure he left no usable assets behind for his victims. Thomas told Eleanor that the financial annihilation she was experiencing was not a byproduct of Richard's affair, it was the primary objective. The financial ruin of the discarded partner was Richard's ultimate mechanism of control, his way of ensuring that his superiority remained unchallenged even after he exited the relationship. Listening to Thomas describe the cold, reptilian mechanics of her husband's mind, Eleanor felt the final, naive layers of her civilized morality burn away. She realized that she had been playing by the rules of a marriage, while Richard had been playing by the rules of a cartel. If she was going to survive the massive debt he had left her, if she was going to reclaim any fraction of her stolen life, she could not rely on the standard legal system. The civil courts are designed to arbitrate disputes between relatively honest citizens. They are entirely unequipped to dismantle a $40 million offshore trust fortified by the best corporate defense attorneys in Manhattan. She needed someone who operated outside the boundaries of ethical compliance. She needed a weapon. She asked Thomas for a name, knowing that a man who had successfully extracted himself from the Vance family syndicate would know exactly who to call when the syndicate needed to be destroyed. Thomas gave her a name and a burner phone number: Gideon Cross. He was a former forensic accountant for the FBI's white-collar crime division, who had been quietly dismissed a decade ago for utilizing unauthorized, highly illegal surveillance methods to break a massive Wall Street insider trading ring. The Bureau could not tolerate his methods, but the private sector quietly craved them. Gideon operated in the absolute darkest, unregulated gray areas of corporate espionage and financial recovery in Manhattan. He did not have an office. He did not have a website. He existed entirely as a rumor among the ultra-wealthy, a ghost you summoned when the law was insufficient to retrieve your stolen capital. Eleanor arranged the meeting for the following night. She chose a dilapidated, dimly lit Irish pub in the deep trenches of Hell's Kitchen, a place so far removed from her Chelsea gallery and her Scarsdale estate that it felt like an entirely different planet. She sat in a sticky vinyl booth in the back corner, wearing a dark trench coat, a completely unrecognizable figure to anyone who knew the elegant, composed Eleanor Vance. Gideon arrived exactly on time. He did not look like a corporate spy. He looked like a tired, cynical academic, wearing a worn tweed jacket, his eyes carrying the heavy, exhausted weight of a man who has spent his entire life staring into the absolute abyss of human greed. He slid into the booth across from her, ordered a black coffee from the terrified bartender, and looked at Eleanor with a complete, unnerving lack of empathy. He did not offer condolences for her husband. He did not ask her how she was feeling. He pulled a small, scrambled recording device from his pocket, placed it on the table, and told her she had 5 minutes to convince him that her case was worth his time. Eleanor did not waste a single second on the emotional betrayal. She did not mention her broken heart or her 12 years of loyalty. She spoke entirely in the language Gideon understood, the language of illicit capital flow. She detailed the timeline of the secondary mortgage, the liquidation of the domestic portfolios, the untraceable wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, and the sudden, immaculate construction of the irrevocable trust bearing the name of a 28-year-old assistant. She recited the routing numbers she had memorized from Harrison Cole's office. She presented the financial architecture of her ruin with the cold, sterile precision of a surgeon presenting a tumor. Gideon listened in absolute silence, his eyes fixed on her, processing the massive, complex data points. When she finished, he took a slow sip of his coffee. He leaned across the table, the air between them thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. He told Eleanor that retrieving money from an offshore irrevocable trust designed by top-tier Manhattan lawyers is statistically impossible. He explained that the trust is an independent legal entity, a sovereign fortress. The moment Richard's heart stopped, that fortress was sealed permanently. But then, Gideon's tired eyes sparked with a terrifying, predatory intelligence. He told her that while you cannot breach the walls of the trust from the outside, you can entirely destroy the foundation upon which the trust was built. He told her that $40 million does not simply vanish into thin air without leaving a massive, bloody trail of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and potentially federal wire fraud. He told her that Richard Vance, in his arrogance, had likely committed dozens of severe federal felonies to rapidly liquidate that much capital and move it offshore. Gideon proposed a strategy that made Eleanor's blood run cold. They were not going to sue the trust for the money. They were going to conduct a massive, illegal forensic audit of Richard's entire commercial real estate empire. They were going to find the bodies Richard had buried to extract that cash. And once they had the absolute, undeniable proof of Richard's federal crimes, they were going to use that evidence to threaten the very lawyers and offshore bankers who were managing the trust. They were going to create a radioactive legal environment so terrifying that the trustees would willingly dismantle the trust to avoid going to federal prison for facilitating a massive money laundering operation. It was a strategy of absolute, scorched earth extortion. Eleanor agreed without a fraction of hesitation. She handed Gideon a cashier's check for his exorbitant retainer, utilizing the last remaining funds in her personal, isolated gallery account. She effectively funded her own shadow war. Over the next 3 weeks, Eleanor maintained the perfect, public facade of the mourning widow. She met with the bank executives who were beginning to encircle the Scarsdale estate like vultures, playing the confused, helpless wife, buying Gideon the time he needed. Meanwhile, Gideon descended into the digital underworld of Richard's empire. Utilizing a network of compromised servers and illicit decryption software, Gideon breached the firewall of Richard's primary holding company. He bypassed the security protocols that Richard had used to lock Eleanor out of her own life. What Gideon began to extract from the dark web of Richard's corporate communications was not just evidence of financial manipulation. It was the blueprint of a sociopathic masterpiece. Late on a Friday night, Gideon summoned Eleanor to a sterile, anonymous hotel room near LaGuardia Airport. The room was stripped bare, the curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the glowing screens of Gideon's multiple laptops. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and ozone. Gideon looked worse than when she had first met him. He looked entirely hollowed out, carrying the shock of a man who has just peered into the darkest corners of human depravity. He did not offer her a seat. He simply turned one of the monitors toward her. He told her that he had spent the last 2 weeks trying to build a profile on Evelyn Mercer, trying to understand how a 28-year-old junior assistant could possess the psychological gravity to convince a paranoid, ruthless titan like Richard Vance to hand over $40 million. He told Eleanor that he had hacked the human resources database of Richard's company, pulled Evelyn's background checks, her college transcripts, her social security history. Gideon looked at Eleanor, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper, and delivered the first shattering truth that entirely ripped the narrative off its hinges. He told her that Evelyn Mercer did not exist. The woman Richard had been sleeping with, the woman named as the sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust, was a phantom. Her social security number belonged to an infant who had died in Ohio in 1998. Her college transcripts were flawlessly forged digital artifacts. The background check Richard's own human resources department had run was completely fabricated, inserted into the system by someone with massive, executive-level access. Evelyn Mercer was a completely manufactured identity, a ghost written into the corporate architecture. Eleanor stared at the screen, her mind violently rejecting the information. If Evelyn Mercer was a ghost, then who was Richard having an affair with? Who did he transfer the money to? The cognitive dissonance was deafening. She asked Gideon, her voice trembling with a terrifying, primal confusion, to explain what she was looking at. Gideon typed a rapid sequence of commands into the terminal, pulling up a series of highly encrypted, secondary emails he had recovered from a hidden server Richard maintained entirely off the books. Gideon explained the terrifying reality of what Richard Vance had actually been doing for the past 18 months. Richard had not fallen in love with an assistant. Richard had been operating a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme within his commercial real estate portfolio for the past 5 years. He had been drastically overvaluing his properties to secure massive loans from aggressive private equity firms, and using those new loans to pay the interest on the old loans. The entire empire was a house of cards, and 18 months ago the cards had begun to collapse. The private equity firms were demanding audits. The SEC was quietly beginning to circle. Richard knew that catastrophic, federal ruin was imminent. He knew that within 2 years, he would be indicted, his assets would be entirely frozen by the government, and he would spend the rest of his natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary. So, the sociopath devised an exit strategy of apocalyptic proportions. He manufactured the identity of Evelyn Mercer. He hired a high-end, discreet escort to play the role of the assistant in the office, creating a physical paper trail of an affair, ensuring that there were rumors, ensuring that his own lawyers and executives believed he was simply a wealthy man losing his mind over a young woman. He used the cover of this highly visible, cliché midlife crisis to explain his erratic behavior and his sudden desire for massive liquid capital. He used the manufactured affair as a smokescreen to systematically drain the legitimate equity from the Scarsdale house and his remaining clean portfolios. He funneled all that clean capital into the offshore irrevocable trust, naming the ghost, Evelyn Mercer, as the beneficiary. But the final, most devastating layer of this revelation, the truth that made Eleanor physically collapse into a chair, was the true purpose of the trust. The $40 million was not a gift to a lover. The trust was Richard's personal, untouchable escape fund. Gideon pulled up a final document, highly secured, encrypted receipt from a specialized boutique firm in Geneva that catered specifically to international fugitives and disgraced oligarchs. The receipt detailed the purchase of two absolute, top-tier non-extradition passports, a completely fabricated new identity corresponding to the beneficiary of the trust, and a fully funded, untraceable private charter flight scheduled to depart from a small airstrip in New Jersey. The flight was scheduled for exactly 3 days after the day Richard died on that squash court. Richard Vance had not died leaving his wealth to a mistress. Richard Vance had spent 18 months orchestrating his own disappearance. He was going to fake his own death, or simply vanish into the wind, utilizing the Evelyn Mercer identity to access the $40 million offshore. He was going to leave Eleanor behind in the Scarsdale estate, completely unaware of the impending apocalypse. He had explicitly designed the collapse to fall squarely on her shoulders. When the private equity firms realized the money was gone, when the SEC raided the offices, Eleanor, as his wife and the remaining legal entity attached to the decaying assets, would be the one facing the federal investigators. She would be the one crushed by the massive debts. She would be the one facing potential conspiracy charges for the financial anomalies he had cleverly woven through their joint tax returns. He had built a bomb, tied his wife to it, and the only reason she had not been obliterated yet was because his biological heart had failed before he could trigger the detonator. The silence in that sterile hotel room was absolute. It was the silence of a woman realizing she was not a discarded wife. She was an intended casualty. She had been married to a man who viewed her completely destruction as the necessary operational cost of his own freedom. He had hated her enough to meticulously frame her for his crimes. The sheer, overwhelming evil of the conspiracy threatened to snap her sanity entirely. But as she stared at the encrypted receipt for the private jet, a new, entirely alien emotion began to flood her nervous system. The panic receded, replaced by an absolute, freezing, and lethal clarity. Richard had died before he could execute the final phase of his plan. He had died leaving the $40 million locked inside an irrevocable trust assigned to a ghost. The money was sitting there, heavily fortified, waiting for an Evelyn Mercer who did not exist to claim it. Gideon looked at Eleanor, seeing the terrifying transformation occurring in her eyes. He saw the civilized art director die, replaced by a woman entirely unburdened by morality or the constraints of the law. Eleanor looked back at the tired, cynical forensic accountant. She did not ask him if they could go to the authorities. She knew that if they went to the FBI, the government would immediately seize the offshore trust as the proceeds of a massive corporate fraud, leaving her entirely bankrupt and still fighting off the banks for the Scarsdale debt. She could not rely on the system to save her, because the system would only consume the capital for itself. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice a calm, modulated whisper that chilled the air in the room. She told Gideon that if Evelyn Mercer was a ghost, a manufactured identity existing only on forged documents and offshore banking ledgers, then Evelyn Mercer could be anyone. She looked at the encrypted file containing the flawless, digitally manufactured background checks, the fake social security numbers, and the precise legal parameters required to access the trust in the Cayman Islands. She realized that Richard had spent 18 months building a perfect, impenetrable financial fortress for his fake identity, completely unaware that he was actually building it for the woman he intended to destroy. She told Gideon that they were no longer trying to dismantle the trust. They were going to steal it. They were going to resurrect the ghost. The concept of human identity in the modern American financial system is a profound and terrifying abstraction. We believe that we exist because we breathe, because we have memories, because we cast a shadow on the pavement. But to the institutions that govern global capital, your flesh and blood are entirely irrelevant. To a bank in the Cayman Islands, you are not a human being. You are a constellation of data points. You are a social security number, a biometric signature, a corresponding series of passwords, and a pristine digital history. If you possess the correct data, you are real. If you do not, you are a ghost. As Eleanor Vance sat in that sterile, ozone-scented hotel room with Gideon Cross, she was not plotting a bank robbery. She was plotting an existential resurrection. She was preparing to murder her own identity and step into the digital skin of a phantom. The psychological threshold one must cross to willingly obliterate their own name is staggering. Eleanor had spent 42 years cultivating her reputation. She was a respected gallery director. She was a patron of the arts. She was a prominent figure in the Westchester Social Registry. But standing in the wreckage of Richard's sociopathic masterpiece, she realized that reputation was a trap. Her good name was the exact anchor Richard had intended to use to drown her. By remaining Eleanor Vance, she was guaranteed federal indictment, massive public humiliation, and inescapable poverty. Survival required a complete, unapologetic sacrifice of the ego. She had to become the very weapon her husband had forged to destroy her. Gideon, operating with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a man completely desensitized to moral boundaries, began to outline the parameters of the heist. He explained that claiming an offshore irrevocable trust is not as simple as walking into a bank with a forged passport. The Cayman Islands banking sector is notorious for its impenetrable secrecy, but it is equally notorious for its draconian verification protocols. The trust was managed by a boutique offshore wealth management firm known for handling the assets of deposed dictators and sanctioned oligarchs. They did not rely solely on paperwork. They relied on a heavily encrypted, multi-layered verification process. Gideon pulled up the digital architecture Richard had designed for the Evelyn Mercer identity. Richard had successfully created the digital ghost, the fake social security number, the credit history, the pristine background check, but he needed a physical avatar to interact with the world, to establish the necessary corporate footprints that made the ghost look real to the offshore compliance officers. This is where the narrative descends into the absolute transactional darkness of Manhattan's elite underbelly. Richard could not simply invent a woman on paper. He needed a woman to be seen entering his office building. He needed a woman to be captured on security cameras. He needed a woman to sign physical documents in the presence of notaries who were paid to look the other way. He needed a physical proxy to flesh out the illusion of his midlife crisis affair. Gideon, diving into the encrypted financial ledgers of Richard's shadow accounts, discovered a series of massive, recurring wire transfers to a high-end, incredibly discreet escort agency operating out of a penthouse in Tribeca. Richard had not hired a lover. He had hired an actress. Her name was Anya Petrov. She was a 26-year-old Russian immigrant who had navigated the brutal, carnivorous hierarchy of the New York sex trade to reach the absolute apex of the industry. She did not work the streets, and she did not advertise on the internet. She was a ghost herself, a luxury commodity traded exclusively among billionaires, politicians, and hedge fund managers. Richard had leased her time for 18 months. He employed the tame and astronomical retainer to play the role of Evelyn Mercer in the physical world. He had her dress in conservative, high-end corporate attire. He had her walk into his lobby twice a week. He had her sit in his office while he forged the documents. He had her record voice messages for the offshore bank's biometric verification system. Anya Petrov was the physical key to the digital fortress. She possessed the voice, the forged physical IDs, and the exact protocols Richard had rehearsed with her to communicate with the Cayman trustees. Gideon looked at Eleanor, his exhausted eyes devoid of any judgment, and told her that they needed Anya. Without the proxy's biometric data and her knowledge of Richard's specific verification routines, Eleanor's attempt to claim the trust would immediately trigger a fraud alert in Geneva, permanently freezing the $40 million. The hunt for Anya Petrov commenced immediately. It is a fascinating psychological exercise to track someone whose entire profession is predicated on invisibility. Gideon utilized his illicit surveillance networks, tracking the burner phones and the encrypted messaging apps favored by the elite escort agencies. It took him 4 days to locate her. Anya was not living in a glamorous penthouse. The reality of that industry is often a stark contrast to the illusion it sells. She lived in a heavily secured, anonymous high-rise in Long Island City, existing in a state of constant, paranoid isolation. Eleanor decided to make the approach herself. Gideon advised against it, warning her of the extreme volatility of individuals operating in that sphere, but Eleanor understood something fundamental about the architecture of power. If Gideon, a strange man with a terrifying aura, approached an elite escort, her immediate response would be defensive. She would assume he was law enforcement or a dangerous client. Eleanor, however, possessed the refined, aristocratic bearing of the ruling class. She knew how to speak the language of absolute authority. On a freezing Tuesday evening, Eleanor waited in the lobby of Anya's building. When the young woman walked through the revolving doors, the physical resemblance was chilling. Anya had the same dark hair, the same bone structure, the same piercing eyes that Richard had always favored. It was like looking into a distorted, younger mirror. Eleanor intercepted her by the elevator bank. She did not introduce herself by name. She simply stated that she was Richard Vance's widow, and that she knew exactly how much Richard had paid for the Evelyn Mercer contract. I have observed many confrontations between the wife and the mistress, but this was entirely devoid of the typical hysterical domestic drama. Eleanor did not slap her. She did not weep. She looked at the young woman with the cold, appraising gaze of a corporate auditor evaluating a compromised asset. Anya froze, her defensive instincts immediately triggering. She was a professional survivor. She knew that the sudden death of a billionaire client usually meant massive, dangerous complications for the people occupying his shadows. Eleanor bypassed the emotional entirely and went straight to the transactional. She invited Anya to a sterile, brightly lit diner across the street. The contrast between the two women sitting in a cheap vinyl booth was jarring. The elegant, 42-year-old art director and the high-end Russian proxy. Over a cup of bitter black coffee, Eleanor laid out the reality of the situation. She did not reveal the $40 million offshore trust. That would be a fatal tactical error. You never reveal the full value of the prize to a mercenary. Instead, she painted a narrative of mutual destruction. She told Anya that Richard's empire was a massive Ponzi scheme that was weeks away from complete federal collapse. She told her that the SEC was already circling, and that when they audited Richard's shadow accounts, they would find the massive, illicit wire transfers to the Tribeca agency. They would find the forged documents Anya had signed as Evelyn Mercer. Eleanor explained that Anya was not just an escort. In the eyes of the federal government, she was a co-conspirator in a massive corporate fraud and wire fraud syndicate. She was facing decades in federal prison. Eleanor watched the blood drain from Anya's flawless face. The young woman's tough, cynical exterior cracked, revealing the terrified immigrant underneath who had built her entire life on the fragile illusion of impunity. Eleanor then offered her the exit. She told Anya that she had hired a team to scrub Richard's shadow servers to erase the digital footprints connecting Anya to the Evelyn Mercer identity. But in exchange, Eleanor required the physical artifacts of the illusion. She needed the forged passports Richard had procured. She needed the burner phones used to contact the Cayman bankers. She needed the exact vocal passcodes and the procedural scripts Richard had forced Anya to memorize. Eleanor was offering a hostage exchange, Anya's freedom from federal prosecution in return for the keys to the kingdom. Anya sat in silence, processing the terrifying parameters of the trap Richard had unwittingly built around her. And it was in this moment, sitting in a cheap Queen's diner, that the narrative fractured again, revealing a layer of sociopathy so deep, so profoundly malicious, that it forever altered Eleanor's understanding of human evil. Anya looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, twisted pity. She realized that Eleanor only knew half the story. Anya took a trembling breath and decided to hand over the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to prove her own value in this negotiation. Anya told Eleanor that Richard had not merely planned to vanish. He had not merely planned to leave Eleanor to face the bankruptcy and the angry creditors. Anya explained that part of her role as Evelyn Mercer involved taking dictation. Richard liked to dictate his thoughts, his strategies, his legal maneuvers, while she sat in the room, treating her like a highly paid, silent piece of furniture. Anya possessed an eidetic memory, a survival skill honed by years of navigating dangerous men. She recounted a specific evening just 2 weeks before Richard's death. Richard had been drinking heavily, celebrating the finalization of the Cayman Trust. He had dictated a highly encrypted email. The email was an anonymous tip, meticulously drafted and pre-scheduled to be sent directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. The tip contained the exact routing numbers, the forged valuations, and the shell company structures of his Ponzi scheme. But the absolute, horrifying genius of the email was its framing. Richard had deliberately manipulated the internal digital signatures on all the fraudulent documents over the past 18 months. He had quietly transferred his own administrative access codes to Eleanor's IP address at the Scarsdale estate. The anonymous tip was designed to look like the action of a terrified whistleblower, exposing Eleanor Vance as the mastermind behind the entire financial collapse. Richard had intended to trigger the email on the exact day he boarded the private jet to vanish. He had actively orchestrated a massive, synchronized federal raid on the Scarsdale estate. He wanted Eleanor dragged out of her home in handcuffs, paraded in front of the media, and locked in a federal holding cell without bail, completely freezing her ability to access any remaining funds or hire adequate legal counsel. He did not just want to leave her poor, he wanted to ensure her absolute physical imprisonment so that she could never, ever track him down. He had weaponized the United States Justice Department to act as his personal assassination squad. The silence that descended upon the diner booth was suffocating. The waitress poured more coffee, completely oblivious to the apocalyptic revelation that had just occurred. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the dark liquid. She felt a profound, tectonic shift within her psychological architecture. The anger evaporated. The betrayal evaporated. What remained was a terrifying, absolute state of war. When a human being realizes that their destruction was not collateral damage, but the primary, meticulously engineered objective of the person they loved, every single moral constraint is permanently severed. The social contract is voided. You are no longer operating in a civilized society. You are operating in a state of nature, where the only law is survival and absolute retaliation. But the horrors of that diner conversation were not yet concluded. Anya, sensing the catastrophic shift in Eleanor's demeanor, delivered the final, fatal blow. She asked Eleanor how Richard could possibly manage the complex legal maneuvers of the Ponzi scheme, the offshore trusts, and the framing of his own wife without an insider. Anya told Eleanor that Richard did not act alone. He had a co-conspirator who managed the legal fortifications, a man who ensured the documents were airtight, a man who had personally flown to the Cayman Islands to finalize the irrevocable trust. Anya gave Eleanor the name of the man who had sat in Richard's office, drinking scotch and laughing as they engineered Eleanor's federal indictment. The name was Harrison Cole, the esteemed, paternal senior partner, the man who had drafted their wills, the man who, just weeks ago, had sat across from Eleanor in his mahogany office, his hands trembling as he played the role of the reluctant messenger delivering the tragic news of her bankruptcy. Harrison Cole was not a messenger, he was the architect. He was a fully complicit, highly compensated partner in the syndicate that had murdered her future. He had sat there, watching her grieve, knowing full well that if Richard had not died of a heart attack, Harrison would have been the one coordinating with the federal prosecutors to ensure Eleanor received the maximum prison sentence. Eleanor stood up from the booth. She did not say a word. She placed $100 bill on the table. She looked at Anya, nodded slowly, and walked out into the freezing New York night. The game had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just about retrieving the $40 million. It was no longer just about surviving the debt. It was about systematic, absolute annihilation. Richard was dead, escaping her wrath, but his empire, his accomplices, and his entire legacy remained vulnerable. Eleanor Vance was dead. The woman walking back to the anonymous hotel room to meet Gideon Cross was a phantom, a weaponized ghost preparing to rain hellfire down upon the elite architects of her ruin. She was going to become Evelyn Mercer, she was going to take the $40 million, and then she was going to use every single cent of that illicit capital to obliterate Harrison Cole and every structure Richard had ever built. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of what Eleanor Vance was about to execute, we must first abandon the pedestrian understanding of theft. When a common criminal robs a bank, they use a firearm to extract insured currency from a vault. It is a crude, physical transaction. But when you are operating in the stratosphere of international offshore banking, you do not use a gun. You use an identity. You weaponize a legal fiction. Eleanor was not preparing to rob a bank. She was preparing to legally inherit an empire by resurrecting a ghost. The psychological toll of this preparation cannot be overstated. For 42 years, Eleanor had existed as a pillar of the Manhattan art establishment. Her identity was her currency. Her name opened doors at the Metropolitan Museum, secured lines of credit, and commanded respect. But sitting in that sterile hotel room in Queens, bathed in the blue light of Gideon Cross's encrypted monitors, she had to systematically murder her own ego. She had to accept that Eleanor Vance was a dead woman walking, a casualty of a sociopathic marriage, destined for federal indictment and public disgrace. To survive, she had to become the phantom her husband had engineered to destroy her. She had to become Evelyn Mercer. The mechanics of claiming an irrevocable offshore trust in the Cayman Islands are designed to be impenetrable by domestic law enforcement. The boutique wealth management firm in Geneva that administered the trust did not answer to American subpoenas. They answered only to the precise biometric and digital keys established by the trust's creator. Richard Vance had spent 18 months perfectly calibrating these keys. He had provided the firm with Evelyn Mercer's forged passports, her digital signatures, and most importantly, her vocal biometrics. Anya Petrov, the elite Russian escort, had been recorded reading specific, legally binding declarative statements to establish the voice print. Gideon, operating with the terrifying proficiency of a man who had spent his career breaking federal firewalls, extracted those voice recordings from the burner phones Eleanor had secured from Anya. He fed the audio files into a highly illegal, military-grade vocal synthesis program. He was building a real-time audio modulator. When Eleanor spoke into the encrypted satellite phone, the Geneva bankers would not hear the refined, mature cadence of the Scarsdale art director. They would hear the exact, verified frequency of the 28-year-old Russian proxy. The execution of the transfer occurred at 3 a.m, New York time, to align with the opening hours of the European financial markets. The hotel room was completely silent, save for the hum of the server's cooling fans. Eleanor sat at the desk, staring at a printout of the exact procedural script Richard had drafted for this moment. Gideon handed her the heavy, black satellite phone. He nodded once, a silent confirmation that the secure routing protocols were active. They were bouncing their signal through 7 different proxy servers across Eastern Europe and South America before connecting to Geneva. Eleanor dialed the international number. The ringing tone echoed in the sterile room, each pulse amplifying the absolute existential terror of the moment. If this failed, if the compliance officer detected a single anomaly, the trust would permanently freeze, the authorities would be alerted, and Eleanor would be arrested for wire fraud before the sun rose over Manhattan. A man answered the phone. He spoke with a crisp, sterile Swiss accent, identifying himself as the senior trustee account manager. He asked for the account identifier. Eleanor read the alphanumeric sequence Richard had generated. The banker paused, the sound of keystrokes echoing over the secure line. He then initiated the biometric verification protocol. He asked Evelyn Mercer to state the primary declarative passphrase. Eleanor, channeling every ounce of absolute, freezing detachment she possessed, spoke into the modulator. She recited the bizarre, deeply personal phrase Richard had chosen, a twisted inside joke about their early marriage that only Richard and Eleanor would know, repurposed here as a security measure. Gideon watched the audio waveforms on his monitor, his finger hovering over the kill switch in case the synthesis fractured. But the software held perfectly. The banker confirmed the voice print. The first gate was breached. But the Cayman institutions do not release $40 million based solely on a recorded phrase. They utilize dynamic security questions, questions formulated from the deeply buried, heavily encrypted personal data Richard had provided. The banker asked a question that made the blood freeze in Eleanor's veins. He asked for the specific street name of the first commercial property Richard Vance had ever developed, a detail that was not listed on any public corporate registry, a detail Richard had supposedly told Evelyn in confidence. Anya's notes, resting on the desk, did not contain the answer. Richard had never prepared the escort for this specific dynamic inquiry. Gideon looked at Eleanor, a flash of pure panic crossing his exhausted face. The silence on the line stretched, becoming highly suspicious. The banker politely asked if Evelyn needed the question repeated. This is the exact moment where the brutal, agonizing intimacy of a 12-year marriage becomes a lethal weapon. Ania Petrov did not know the answer because Ania was a leased asset, but Eleanor Vance knew the answer. Eleanor remembered a rainy afternoon in their first year of marriage, driving through a decaying industrial sector of Brooklyn, where Richard had pointed to a dilapidated warehouse on a dead-end road and boasted about his very first highly leveraged acquisition. Eleanor closed her eyes, visualizing the rusted street sign. She spoke the name of the street into the modulator with absolute, unwavering confidence. The banker paused. The silence was agonizing. And then, the sound of a heavy, definitive keystroke echoed through the receiver. The banker confirmed the security clearance. He asked for the destination routing numbers for the liquidation of the trust. Gideon immediately fed Eleanor a sequence of heavily scrambled, decentralized cryptocurrency wallets and anonymous holding accounts he had established in non-extraditable jurisdictions. It took 45 minutes of excruciating, methodical legal recitation to finalize the transfer. When the call finally disconnected, Gideon collapsed back into his chair, rubbing his face with trembling hands. He pulled up his master terminal. Slowly, line by line, the ledgers began to update. The numbers cascaded across the screen in brilliant, neon green. $40 million. The absolute sum of Richard Vance's sociopathic labor, the capital he had murdered his own marriage to secure, had just been flawlessly hijacked by the wife he intended to destroy. Eleanor did not celebrate. She looked at the staggering sum on the monitor, and she felt the final, terrifying transformation complete itself. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a widow. She was a massively capitalized, entirely invisible apex predator. But acquiring the capital was only the first phase of the campaign. Money, in the abstract, is merely potential energy. To achieve the absolute, scorched earth vengeance Eleanor required, she had to convert that capital into kinetic, structural violence. She had to destroy Harrison Cole. And she had to destroy him not merely by exposing him, but by trapping him inside the exact same inescapable, suffocating labyrinth of federal prosecution and financial ruin he had helped build for her. Gideon, now operating with the unlimited resources of the stolen trust, initiated a massive, aggressive shadow operation against Harrison Cole's law firm. He did not hack their servers to steal money, he hacked them to steal leverage. Over the next week, Gideon dissected Harrison's entire professional existence. He analyzed the firm's offshore tax shelters, the illicit kickbacks Harrison received from private equity firms, and the deeply buried, highly unethical escrow maneuvers Harrison executed to hide the assets of his billionaire clients. Harrison Cole presented himself as a pillar of the New York legal establishment, but his foundation was built entirely on elite, white-collar corruption. Gideon compiled a dossier so profoundly devastating that its mere existence could dismantle the law firm, trigger a massive FBI raid, and send Harrison and his senior partners to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. But a dossier is just paper. Eleanor needed the perfect theater to execute the kill. She needed to lure the architect back to the scene of the crime. She called Harrison's office, utilizing her perfectly cultivated, grief-stricken widow persona. She told his secretary that she was overwhelmed by the foreclosure notices on the Scarsdale estate, that the private equity creditors were harassing her constantly, and that she desperately needed Harrison to come to the house to help her finalize the bankruptcy filings. She played the helpless, terrified victim flawlessly. Harrison, blinded by his own arrogance and his absolute certainty that Eleanor was a defeated, clueless woman, agreed to a private meeting at the estate on a Friday evening. The Scarsdale house was a mausoleum. The power had been partially shut off due to unpaid bills, leaving the massive, echoing rooms cast in deep shadows. A heavy, relentless November rain battered the leaded glass windows, mirroring the violent storm of the night Richard had orchestrated his own fake death. Eleanor waited for Harrison in Richard's cavernous, mahogany-paneled office. She sat behind Richard's massive antique desk, wearing a stark, perfectly tailored white suit, a glaring contrast to the surrounding darkness. When Harrison arrived, he let himself in, navigating the dark hallways with the familiarity of a man who believed he owned the property by right of conquest. He stepped into the office, his expensive cashmere overcoat dripping rain onto the Persian rug. He looked at Eleanor, attempting to project his usual aura of paternal, legal authority. He carried his heavy leather briefcase, ready to force her to sign the documents that would finalize her absolute financial ruin. Harrison sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk. He did not offer condolences this time. The pretense of mourning was over. He adopted a tone of brisk, corporate efficiency, explaining that the creditors were moving to seize the house by Monday, and that her only viable legal option was to declare personal bankruptcy and surrender all remaining marital assets to the holding companies he represented. He unclasped his briefcase, the sound loud in the quiet room. Eleanor watched him with a cold, unblinking fascination. She let him speak for a full 5 minutes, allowing him to construct his elaborate, patronizing narrative of legal inevitability. When he finally paused, expecting her to weep or beg for a reprieve, Eleanor simply reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a single, heavily encrypted digital tablet. She slid it across the polished mahogany, exactly as Harrison had slid the fraudulent asset summary to her weeks ago. She told him to look at the screen. Harrison, mildly irritated by the interruption, picked up the tablet. What he saw on the screen was not a bankruptcy filing. It was a live, real-time view of a decentralized offshore banking ledger. It displayed a massive, continuous stream of capital moving through anonymous routing numbers. It displayed a current balance of $40 million. Harrison's aristocratic face froze, the color drained from his skin with terrifying speed. His eyes darted from the screen to Eleanor, his brain desperately trying to process the absolute impossibility of what he was witnessing. He recognized the exact routing numbers. He recognized the structure of the trust. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the desk, mirroring the posture of a judge preparing to deliver a capital sentence. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a surgical, chilling precision. She told Harrison that she knew everything. She detailed the Ponzi scheme. She detailed the manufactured identity of Evelyn Mercer. She detailed the Tribeca escort agency and the Ford Cayman documents. She watched as Harrison's breathing became shallow, rapid, his entire central nervous system entering a state of catastrophic shock as the walls of his impenetrable conspiracy violently collapsed around him. But Eleanor was not finished. She leaned closer, the ambient light reflecting in her cold, dead eyes, and she delivered the revelation that completely shattered the lawyer's sanity. She told him that she knew about the anonymous whistleblower email Richard had pre-scheduled to send to the SEC. She told him she knew that he and Richard had meticulously orchestrated a federal raid to frame her for the entire collapse of the commercial real estate empire. She told him she knew that she was supposed to be in a federal holding cell, bearing the full weight of Richard's crimes, while they divided the spoils of the offshore trust. Harrison attempted to speak. He attempted to deploy his weaponized legal vocabulary, to threaten her with extortion charges, to deny his involvement. He stammered that attorney-client privilege protected him, that she had no proof, that Richard had acted entirely alone. It was the pathetic, desperate flailing of a shark bleeding out in the water. Eleanor raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. She told him that attorney-client privilege does not cover the active commission of a massive federal felony. And then, she deployed the weapon Gideon had built. She slid a thick, heavy manila file across the desk. It was the exact physical counterpart to the file Harrison had used to destroy her life. She told him to open it. Harrison's hands shook violently as he flipped open the cover. Inside was the absolute, undeniable forensic proof of his own corruption. It contained the encrypted emails between him and Richard, detailing the framing of Eleanor. It contained the offshore banking records proving Harrison had personally funded the Tribeca escort agency. It contained the exact blueprints of his illicit escrow maneuvers for his other billionaire clients. Eleanor delivered the terms of his execution. She told him that the $40 million was gone, permanently absorbed into an untraceable digital ecosystem she controlled. She told him that the original Evelyn Mercer Trust had been drained, leaving a massive, glaring void in the Cayman records. She explained that Gideon had spent the last 3 hours selectively leaking fragments of Harrison's dossier to the senior investigative reporters at the Wall Street Journal and the Enforcement Division of the SEC. The leak did not mention Eleanor. The leak framed Harrison Cole as the sole mastermind behind the collapse of Richard Vance's empire. The narrative she had constructed painted Harrison as a rogue, sociopathic lawyer who had manipulated his client into a massive Ponzi scheme, murdered him via a stress-induced heart attack, and attempted to steal the capital offshore. Harrison stared at her, absolute, primal terror radiating from his eyes. He realized the magnitude of the trap. He was entirely isolated. Richard was dead. The money was gone. And the federal government was already looking at him as the architect of a billion-dollar fraud. He realized that the elegant, sophisticated art director sitting across from him had evolved into a monster far more terrifying and efficient than Richard could have ever dreamed of becoming. And it was in this moment of total, psychological annihilation that Harrison Cole finally broke. A high, hysterical, utterly broken laugh erupted from his chest. It was the sound of a man staring directly into the abyss and realizing the abyss had outmaneuvered him. He dropped the file onto the desk, leaning back in his chair, running his trembling hands through his silver hair. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wild, manic, and he decided that if he was going down into the inferno, he was going to drag her entire perception of reality down with him. He was going to inflict the maximum possible psychological damage before the FBI arrived. Harrison stopped laughing. He leaned across the desk, his voice a ragged, hateful whisper. He told Eleanor that she was incredibly smart, that she had executed a flawless financial heist, but that she was still operating under a fundamental, pathetic delusion. He told her she believed Richard was the monster who had planned to frame her. He told her she believed she had just outsmarted her husband's ghost. Harrison smiled, a twisted, grotesque expression of absolute malice. He told her that Richard Vance was a coward. He told her that Richard did not have the psychological fortitude to frame his own wife. Harrison revealed the ultimate, devastating truth that fundamentally altered the entire gravitational pull of the conspiracy. He explained that Richard had indeed built the Ponzi scheme, and Richard had indeed panicked when the SEC started circling. Richard had wanted to confess. End of quote. Richard had wanted to liquidate what he could, hire the best defense attorneys, and serve his time in a minimum security country club prison. Richard had actually loved Eleanor in his own weak, pathetic way, and he had intended to leave her the Scarsdale estate free and clear as a gesture of apology. Harrison leaned closer, his eyes burning with a terrifying, sociopathic pride. He told Eleanor that he could not allow Richard to confess, because if Richard confessed, the investigation would inevitably expose Harrison's role in facilitating the fraud. Harrison needed Richard to disappear, but he also needed a fall guy to distract the federal prosecutors. Harrison was the one who conceived the Evelyn Mercer identity. Harrison was the one who hired the escort and forced Richard to play along. Harrison was the one who forged the power of attorney to secretly mortgage the Scarsdale estate, completely draining Eleanor's safety net. And most importantly, Harrison was the one who drafted the anonymous whistleblower email framing Eleanor. Richard had discovered the email 2 days before his death. Richard had realized that his trusted lawyer and best friend was planning to utterly destroy his wife. Richard had threatened to expose Harrison. He had threatened to go to the authorities and bring the entire empire down on Harrison's head. Harrison's voice dropped to a dead, chilling monotone. He told Eleanor that the aortic aneurysm on the squash court was not a tragedy of genetics. It was a chemical assassination. Harrison explained that he had access to Richard's private locker at the athletic club. He had introduced a highly concentrated, untraceable synthetic stimulant into Richard's pre-workout supplement, a compound specifically designed to catastrophically spike the blood pressure of a man with Richard's known cardiovascular history. Harrison had stood on that squash court, watching his client's heart literally explode in his chest, knowing that the medical examiner would rule it a natural, tragic event brought on by the stress of a collapsing real estate market. Harrison Cole had murdered his best friend. He had stolen the capital. He had engineered the complete destruction of Eleanor Vance. And he had planned to claim the $40 million utilizing the Evelyn Mercer proxy, retiring to a private island while Eleanor rotted in a federal penitentiary. He was the puppet master, the apex predator who had manipulated every single variable on the board. Harrison looked at Eleanor, expecting to see her shatter. He expected her to collapse into hysterics, realizing the sheer, mind-bending depth of the evil she had been surrounded by. He expected the revelation of Richard's murder and Richard's final, pathetic attempt to protect her to break her resolve. But Eleanor Vance did not shatter. The woman sitting behind the mahogany desk had transcended the capacity for emotional shock. The revelation did not break her. It solidified her absolute moral authority. She realized she was not just avenging her own financial ruin. She was executing a lethal, necessary judgment against a man who viewed human life as entirely disposable capital. Eleanor looked at the man who had murdered her husband and architected her destruction. She did not scream. She simply reached out and pressed a single button on her encrypted tablet. She told Harrison that she had assumed Richard was too intellectually lazy to engineer a conspiracy of this magnitude. She told him that she had known from the moment she met with Anya Petrov that Harrison was the true architect. And she told him that the entire conversation they had just had, including his detailed, arrogant confession to the premeditated murder of Richard Vance, had just been live-streamed over an encrypted connection directly to Gideon Cross, who had simultaneously routed the unedited audio file to the personal inbox of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Harrison Cole froze. The arrogant, sociopathic fire in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a corpse. He realized he had just delivered his own execution order into a live microphone. He realized that the Scarsdale estate was not a meeting place. It was a lethal, inescapable trap designed specifically to exploit his own narcissistic need to gloat. Eleanor stood up from the desk. She looked down at the broken, hyperventilating man who had once commanded the heights of the Manhattan legal elite. She told him that the FBI was likely already securing the perimeter of the Scarsdale gates. She told him that he would be indicted for federal wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and the first-degree murder of Richard Vance. She told him that he would be denied bail, that his assets would be seized by the government, and that he would die in a concrete box, completely erased from the history of the world he thought he controlled. Eleanor Vance buttoned her white suit coat. She picked up her tablet, walked around the desk, and walked past Harrison Cole without a single backward glance. She walked out of the mahogany office, down the sweeping staircase, and out the heavy oak doors into the freezing November rain. She left the estate entirely abandoned, a haunted monument to the hubris of men who believe they can quantify and control the human soul. She walked down the long, winding driveway, dissolving into the darkness, leaving Harrison Cole to wait in the absolute silence for the sirens to arrive. The immediate aftermath of a systemic demolition is rarely as cinematic as the explosion itself. When the adrenaline evaporates and the dust settles over the ruins of a life, what remains is the grueling, bureaucratic reality of consequence. Eleanor Vance walked out of the Scarsdale estate, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open to the freezing November rain. She did not look back to see the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles storming the long, manicured driveway. She did not stay to watch Harrison Cole, a man who had spent 3 decades manipulating the highest echelons of the American legal system, dragged out of her home in handcuffs, hyperventilating and completely broken. She walked down the dark, winding roads of Westchester County, a phantom dissolving into the night. The transformation was absolute. Eleanor Vance, the celebrated art director, the loyal wife, the tragic widow, ceased to exist. In her place stood a highly capitalized, entirely invisible architect of her own survival. The media spectacle that erupted over the following weeks was a terrifying testament to the carnivorous nature of the American news cycle. The Wall Street Journal, fueled by the selective, catastrophic leaks provided by Gideon Cross, broke the story of the Vance empire collapse. The narrative presented to the public was a masterpiece of misdirection. Richard Vance was posthumously exposed as the architect of a massive, multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate Ponzi scheme, but the true villain, the mastermind who had orchestrated the fraud and subsequently murdered his own client to cover his tracks, was Harrison Cole. The revelation that a senior partner at a white shoe Manhattan law firm had utilized a chemical agent to induce a fatal heart attack on a squash court sent absolute shockwaves through the financial elite. Harrison's trial was the most heavily covered legal event of the decade. He hired the most expensive defense attorneys in the country, men who had previously been his colleagues and golf partners, but the digital evidence Eleanor had secured was impenetrable. The audio recording of his arrogant confession, echoing in the cavernous, empty Scarsdale office, was the final nail in his coffin. Harrison Cole, a man who believed he was untouchable, was sentenced to life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He was entirely stripped of his assets, his reputation, and his freedom, condemned to die in a concrete cell, a victim of his own monstrous hubris. But the true genius of Eleanor's campaign was the absolute, airtight preservation of her own innocence in the eyes of the law. As the federal prosecutors seized the remaining, heavily indebted assets of the Vance empire, Eleanor played her final public role flawlessly. She appeared in bankruptcy court wearing modest, inexpensive clothing, presenting herself as the ultimate, tragic casualty of the conspiracy. She surrendered the Scarsdale estate to the banks. She allowed her Chelsea gallery to be liquidated to satisfy the outstanding corporate debts Richard had fraudulently attached to her name. She watched as the federal government scoured her bank accounts, finding absolutely nothing but the meager, drained savings Richard had left behind. The prosecutors, entirely focused on the massive conviction of Harrison Cole, viewed Eleanor with profound pity. They saw a woman who had been systematically deceived, bankrupted, and nearly framed by a sociopathic syndicate. They did not look deeper. They did not search for the $40 million that had vanished from the Cayman Islands, because according to Harrison's own seized records, that money had been intended for an escort named Anya Petrov, playing the role of Evelyn Mercer. And when the FBI raided the Tribeca escort agency, they found that Anya Petrov had completely vanished, leaving behind an empty apartment and a scrubbed digital footprint, entirely funded by a generous severance package Eleanor had provided. The federal government closed the books. They concluded that the $40 million had been lost in the complex, untraceable labyrinth of offshore cryptocurrency tumbling services utilized by the Russian syndicate. Eleanor Vance officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, legally absolving herself of the massive debts Richard had engineered. She stepped out of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan a completely destitute woman on paper. But the reality, the terrifying, triumphant reality she carried in the absolute silence of her own mind, was that she was now one of the wealthiest independent women in the United States. She had successfully hijacked a sociopath's escape pod. The process of rebuilding a life upon a foundation of stolen, illicit capital requires a terrifying level of discipline. You cannot simply walk into a bank in Beverly Hills and deposit $40 million in decentralized cryptocurrency. Eleanor understood that the wealth she possessed was radioactive. She retained the services of Gideon Cross on a permanent, highly classified retainer. Gideon, functioning as her shadow financial manager, meticulously began the grueling process of laundering the capital back into the legitimate global economy. They utilized a staggering network of shell companies registered in Delaware, anonymous art acquisitions in Geneva, and heavily obscured real estate investments in emerging markets. Eleanor Vance died in the public records of New York, but a new entity was born in the deep, untraceable currents of global finance. I have tracked the whispers of her new existence through the darkest, most exclusive channels of the art world. Eleanor did not remain in New York. The city was a graveyard of her past naivete. She relocated to the brutally beautiful, isolating landscape of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. She purchased a massive, hyper-secure architectural fortress nestled in the Teton Range, a property accessible only by a private, heavily guarded road. She no longer directs a public gallery. She operates as an anonymous, highly influential private dealer, moving multi-million-dollar antiquities and contemporary masterpieces between European oligarchs and Silicon Valley billionaires. She conducts her business entirely through encrypted channels, utilizing layers of legal representation to ensure her physical identity is never attached to a single transaction. She lives a life of absolute, uncompromising luxury, surrounded by priceless art and impenetrable security, but it is a life of profound, enforced solitude. We must ask ourselves what happens to the human soul when it is forced to consume the monster that tried to devour it. Eleanor Vance survived the ultimate betrayal. She outmaneuvered two of the most ruthless, predatory men in Manhattan. But survival at that altitude requires the permanent amputation of vulnerability. Eleanor can never again experience the simple, naive comfort of unconditional trust. She looks at the men in her elite social circles and does not see potential partners or friends. She sees risk assessments, legal vulnerabilities, and potential adversaries. The woman who once believed in the sanctity of marriage, who believed that a shared life was a fortress against the world, was murdered by her husband. The woman residing in the Wyoming fortress is a purely transactional entity. She is brilliant, she is untouchable, and she is entirely alone. She won the war, but the spoils of that war are cold, silent, and heavily encrypted. This story is a terrifying autopsy of the American aristocratic dream. We are sold this glittering, flawless narrative of high net worth marriages. We see the charity galas, the the spreading estates, the perfectly curated public images of absolute stability. We are conditioned to aspire to that level of insulation. But the dark, agonizing truth that resides in the shadows of extreme wealth is that money does not insulate you from predators, it actively attracts them. And the most dangerous predators do not break into your home wearing ski masks. They wear bespoke suits, they draft your wills, they sleep in your bed, and they utilize the very legal structures designed to protect you as the weapons of your destruction. The Vance Empire was not destroyed by a market crash or a bad investment. It was destroyed by the absolute, sociopathic greed of the men who built it, men who viewed human beings as disposable capital. Eleanor's journey forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about justice. The justice system in this country is not designed to protect the innocent. It is designed to manage liability and penalize the sloppy. Harrison Cole did not go to prison because the system worked. Harrison Cole went to prison because Eleanor Vance stepped outside the boundaries of the law, engaged in massive federal wire fraud, stole $40 million, and utilized that stolen capital to execute a flawlessly orchestrated blackmail campaign. She had to become a criminal to secure the justice the state was entirely unequipped to provide. This is the brutal calculus of survival in the modern era. When the institutions designed to protect you are compromised by the very people attempting to destroy you, compliance is suicide. You must possess the psychological fortitude to abandon the rules of civilized society and operate with the cold, absolute ruthlessness of the wilderness. I want you to think about the financial architecture of your own life. I want you to think about the passwords you share, the joint accounts you maintain, and the legal documents you have signed without thoroughly reading the fine print. We surrender massive portions of our autonomy under the guise of love and partnership, blindly trusting that the person across the table will never weaponize that vulnerability. Eleanor Vance's story is a chilling reminder that absolute trust is a luxury no one can afford. You must understand the mechanics of your own survival. You must know where the exits are. You must know who holds the keys, and you must never, under any circumstances, allow another human being to become the sole architect of your reality. Because the moment you relinquish control of your foundation, you are simply waiting for the day they decide to demolish the building. Eleanor resides in the mountains now, watching the snow fall over the jagged peaks, completely insulated from the world that tried to consume her. She is a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation. She did not just survive the fire, she absorbed it, weaponized it, and burned her enemies to ash. She is a phantom of the American dream, a woman who proved that the only way to beat the devil is to own the hell he created. This is Sofia Coppola, bringing you the darkest, most complex narratives hiding behind the polished facades of American society. Thank you for walking through this terrifying labyrinth of betrayal, wealth, and absolute vengeance with me. If this story forced you to reevaluate the structures of your own life, if it opened your eyes to the invisible dangers of blind trust, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share this episode. Your support allows us to continue dissecting the truth hidden in the shadows. Stay vigilant, question everything, and remember that the most dangerous lies are the ones told by the people you love the most. I will see you in the next episode.